Thank you again for the introduction. My name is Akshay Rajhans. I'm a research scientist at MathWorks, and this is joint work with my teammates Anastasia, Pieter, and Roberto, as well as three summer research interns from our team, Zhan, Anastasios, and Mehmet from last summer. And the title is A Simulator for Trading Traffic Privileges by Selfish Driving Cars. So now you may have heard of the term self-driving cars, but what do we mean by selfish driving? So I'm going to motivate it by showing a little video of humans navigating complex scenarios. So we as drivers navigate scenarios and uncertainties based on our intuition and experience that we have accumulated over the past several years. But increasingly, it's also a function of circumstances and preferences. So risk tolerance for one driver may not be the same as the other. And also for the same driver, if you are in a rush, then you might possibly be willing to accept smaller gaps in traffic, for example. Now, if you don't have access to the right of way for a particular driving segment, and if you really needed it, for example, if you are in a hurry, what might you do? So a human driver might start inching forward and indicate that they are interested in getting into the traffic. And if the other car is paying attention and if they are driving leniently, so perhaps they'll let you go. So that informal sort of interaction may succeed. So the question is, how do we formalize this for connected autonomous vehicles? So let me show you the contribution of this paper. This is the simulator we have built for studying selfish driving. And the two colored cars you see here are driving selfishly, and they're basically requesting access to the intersection, and the other white cars are slowing down for them. So let's look at it once again. All right, so there's a lot going on behind the scenes, so let's unpack a little bit what's going on. So the research questions that we study in this paper, the overarching question is, how do connected autonomous vehicles navigate intersections? And that's the simulator to study that behavior. And within that, there are two sub-questions. So one is, how do we unambiguously determine who owns the resource? So if you want to request the ownership from some other car, you need to know whom to ask. So we need to disambiguate that. And the second half is, once that is determined, then how can we interactively drive in a harmonious manner like humans do? So the question here is, what is the equivalent of waving at each other to let the other car go? In this paper, we consider an idealized T-junction intersection configuration, simply because it's the simplest yet rich enough intersection that has all these interesting interactions. We consider, for simplicity, one lane from each direction, which without loss of generality, we call them west, south, and east. And we do not consider any U-turns or passing. The intersection area is the one in the center, which is partitioned into three distinct conflict zones. And the benefit of doing that is really that for pairwise trajectories that are not in conflict with each other, more than one car can navigate the intersection at the same time. For example, these two, and in the best case, all three. Okay, so in terms of the simulator setup, the simulator is built in MATLAB release R2019a, and on the plant side, each car is based on the well-known bicycle dynamic model from the literature, where there are 4 state variables: x, y position, the psi is the orientation, and v is the velocity. The parameters are taken from the vehicle dynamics block set, which are realistic parameters from the real world. On the controller side, we use a discrete time PID control, and here it's basically tracking reference profiles. So in terms of position and orientation as well, you see that the reference trajectory is basically just given by the intersection geometry, and here you see some example trajectories overlaid on top of the intersection geometry. And for the velocity, which you don't see in this top-down picture, you can plot a distance versus time, where the distance is distance to the center of the intersection. And you see the profile that we follow for the reference is when they are far away, they have some constant parametric reference velocity, and the parameter of choice is meant to be an indicator of how aggressive a particular driver is. Then the second half, when they're close to the intersection, then basically they follow a deceleration profile in order to safely go through the intersection. And once they have obtained the right of way, then again they accelerate towards the constant reference velocity. So now let's look at how do we unambiguously determine the ownership of the resource. So here we use a priority queue for each of the three conflict zones, and a higher priority gets a lower number. So we can think of it in terms of this table where each of the cars is a column and each of the conflict zones is a row. And here is the example scenario on the right from the paper, where there are two cars coming from the south, one from the west and one from the east, and they are going towards the directions indicated by the little arrows. So here note that because there is no passing, we only need to actively monitor the three heads of the incoming segments. So these are car number 1, 4 and 3, and car number 2 we sort of have it in the background. So what values do we use for filling out this table? So there are two special values. The one is for cars that do not need access to a particular conflict zone. We use the don't care value of -1, and the other one is the default priority of 0, where, for example, if the car 4 were to not be there or were to be far away, then cars 1 and 3 are requesting access to complementary set of zones. So 3 to A and 3 asks for A and B, and 1 asks for C. So in this case, you get by default you get a priority of 0. So for all other cases where there is contention, where there is at least 2 cars asking for a particular conflict zone, we use the numbers 1 and 2. So the car that has the 1 priority can go, and the car that has 2 priority must yield to the other car. And these priorities are not computed continuously. It turns out we only need to compute them at discrete events when there is a significant change. And there are 2 kinds of discrete events where such a change happens. One is when a new car reaches a prioritization perimeter, which is shown by this gray rectangle around the intersection. And the other one is when an existing car leaves the intersection and the new car behind it becomes the head of a queue. So in this case, when 1 leaves, then 2 becomes the head of the queue, and then we need a reassignment of priorities. For basically the contentious priorities 1 and 2, here is how we compute them. So our approach is first come, first serve. But for cars that are not yet at the intersection, it's based on estimated first come, first serve. So who is estimated to reach the intersection first. And for cars that are actually at the intersection, then we just observe what order in which they arrived at the intersection. So it's first come, first serve based on actual arrival. And then because we need a unique resolution of the scenario, we merge them and resolve them into an appropriate total order for the priorities for different cars. And these intermediate numbers we further optimize to use smallest possible numbers, which end up in 1s and 2s always, because there are at most 2 cars requesting a particular conflict zone access. And so if you look at the overall priority queue table, then if a car has all 0s or all 1s in its column, then it is okay to enter the intersection for that car. And if you look at the rows, then at most there can at most be 1 0 or 1 in each row, otherwise there'll be an accident. So now let's follow the scenario from the paper over time in this distance versus time plot. So I've shown the various cars that appear in the particular conflict zone on the left hand side, and re-laid out the various labels. So at time equals 6.7, the first event of priority assignment happens where car number 1 has now reached the prioritization perimeter, and we look at now all possible cars that are within the wider reachable perimeter, and that happens to be only car number 3. And so because car numbers 1 and 3 are asking for complementary access, then we have this 0 priorities, which I already talked about for motivating the need for 0 priorities. So then cars 1 and 3 are okay to enter the intersection, but they are not yet at the intersection. As time moves forward at t equals 10.4, another new car, which is car 4, now enters the prioritization parameter. At this point, we need to reassign the priorities. 1 and 3 were already within the reachable zone, but now 2 is also in the reachable zone. However, it's not the head of the queue, so for now we can ignore it. So for our P priorities, the order of expected arrival for the different cars is 1 followed by 4 followed by 3. So that's why you see the numbers 1, 2, and 3 in that order. And since none of the cars have actually reached the intersection, there are no queue priorities at this point. So the merged or resolved priorities are the same as P priorities. And the compacted priorities basically are shown in this table, where the 2, 3 get compacted into smaller numbers 1, 2 without losing the relative order. So at this point we can see that car 1 can go, and car 3, even though it had the default access in the earlier priority assignment, it has lost it now. So then time moves forward, and at time equals 16.5, the car 1 exits zone C. So this is our next reassignment event. And at this point, car number 2 is the new head of the segment coming from south. And the order of expected arrival is 3 followed by 4 followed by 2. So you get the numbers 1, 2, and 3 in this table like this. And by now, cars 3 and 4 and also car 1, which already left, had already crossed this stopping parameter, which we consider as being queued up near the intersection. And so there you see the order of arrival of the cars at the intersection zones B and C are 1 and 2 and 1 for the left car, car number 1, and 2 for the car number 4 for zone C. So here you see that the need for merging, because these two assignments are clearly in conflict. And the details of the merging are in the paper, and I wouldn't have time to go through it. But the summary is in table 3. And after the algorithmic reconciliation of these two tables, we end up with the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 shown in this table R. And those are further compacted to have numbers 1 and 2 as shown in the final S priorities for this. Okay, so the rest of the scenario continues, and it's straightforward to follow it in the paper. All right, let's now look at how to interactively navigate a situation like the humans do. So here we propose a mechanism for transferring of privilege as follows. The transfer is incentivized using a currency notion. It doesn't have to be tied to physical money, but it could be a social currency like thank you or kudos. The value to a buyer or a seller is computed based on the number of conflict zones that they need access to in order to navigate the intersection. And there is an urgency parameter, which is basically there to capture the amount of price that you're willing to pay to have access to a particular zone. And that's preset per scenario per car. If that number is greater than 0, then you are open to buying privilege from some other car. And a trading or transfer takes place if all of these three situations are met. One is that the requester or the buyer is within the negotiation perimeter, and the requester has more urgency than the owner. And of course, the underlying requirement is that the owner can still safely come to a stop before entering this intersection by handing over the ownership to another car. So this is the example from the paper for trading of privileges. So car 4 is the one car coming from south, which is the first car to arrive at the intersection. But we see here that it transfers its privilege to car number 2 and here to car number 3. And subsequently you see that the cars pass the original owner, car number 4 here, and the scenario continues. So let's now look at the video I showed at the beginning of the presentation, but now with annotations of whatever is going on behind the scenes. So here you see the determination of ownership based on these discrete events. Here we see the request of transfer of kudos, transfer of ownership accordingly, and Now this car is a new head. It's asking for access to the intersection. Transfer is happening, and then these cars are now going through the intersection. All right. So to conclude my talk, we basically in this paper looked at intersections that are representative examples of contested resources that can be interactively navigated. And other examples for this could include driving space in a lane when you're driving next to another car on a highway and you would like to change lanes, and you ask a similar question to a neighboring car to try to buy a privilege. But also parking spots in contested spaces. And then we built a simulator to study tens of thousands of scenarios and observe rigorously what level of urgency successfully gives us access, what level of urgency is paying too much money, etc. All those questions can be easily answered. And the simulator is built on physical dynamics of vehicles. And then in order to build this, we solved two research questions, which is unambiguous determination of ownership of the resource, as well as a mechanism for interactively navigation the intersection by transferring of privileges. So thank you so much.